Welcome to another day with Jesus, a daily devotional podcast to help you walk with Jesus, live for Jesus, and represent Jesus. Now let us open our heart to receive as Pastor Preji shares from the heart of God.
Greetings to you in Jesus' precious name. Welcome to this amazing new day that the Lord has blessed us with. We enter this day with thankfulness, with praise in our hearts, and worship overflowing out of everything that God has blessed us with. Sometimes we don't see the blessings that God has given us in its complete form. It doesn't seem to be manifesting in our lives. And that is where we need to become attentive, and we have to acknowledge even those smallest, tiniest of things that the Lord is doing in our lives. See, when the psalmist, when they would write the Psalms, they would talk about raw emotions in their heart that they are experiencing and they are feeling, and they would bring those raw emotions to God. Now, when we read these emotions, we may look at their expressions and it may look to us as faithlessness. But the fact that they were still coming to God with those raw emotions was also a sign of worship and dependence on God. They were coming to God for an answer, for a solution to what they were going through, what they were feeling. And some of us may be able to relate with this morning. And my hope is that you would make it your cry, you would make it your prayer, you would make it your desire to depend on God even when you are broken. Let me read out Psalms 42 and verse 9. The psalmist says, "O God, my rock, I cry." See, he's calling on to God who is his rock, and he's crying even as he's calling God's name out. He's confessing that God is his rock, but he's crying because he knows that in this season he has been sinking. He knows that he is not able to stand steady. See, if he has God as his rock, does he need to cry? And yet, in the midst of all the contradictions, he stands up and he declares that you are my God and you are indeed my rock. And he goes on to say, "Why have you forgotten me? Why have you stopped thinking about me? Or why have you stopped caring for me? Why have you forgotten me?" That's the prayer that he is praying to God. Now, see, it's one thing to feel it in your heart. It's another thing to bring it out before God. You know, in human relationships, when you feel something about somebody, you usually don't want to express it to them unless if that person is very close to you. Like, if you feel somebody walking on the road has a bad intention, you wouldn't go confront that guy. But if you feel your spouse or your sibling has a bad intention towards you, then you would immediately confront that person. You wouldn't confront every person on social media. I mean, if you are somebody who is confronting every person on social media that says something about you, then there is definitely some issue, then there is definitely some problem. But we do confront those people that mean a lot to us, that mean very dear to us. And here is the psalmist, he is going to God and he's confronting God with this question, "Why have you forgotten me?" That itself, that confrontation itself, is a proof of his dependency on God and dependency on that relationship that he has with God, dependency on that intimacy that he desires to have with the Lord. Then he goes on to say, "Why must I wander around in grief?" He's telling the Lord and he's saying, "Oh God, you are my rock. Why have you forgotten me? And why must I wander around in grief?" Now, you and I, we may experience grief here on earth. You and I, we may become confused, especially when we experience grief. You and I, we may feel like we are wandering around without direction, without a knowledge of where we are headed to or what next steps to take. We may experience seasons in life when we may feel like we are in fact wandering around in grief. See, grief has a way of taking your eyes off of the path that you're supposed to walk on And grief has a way of creating a delusion that God doesn't care for you, that God doesn't fight for you, that God is not on your side. And grief has a way of making you wander in the wilderness for 40 long years. But this morning, if you're willing to bring that grief into the presence of God, if you're willing to bring that lack of direction, lack of guidance to the presence of God and pour out your heart before Him, if you're willing to break open your heart in His presence, then God has a solution for you. Then He goes on to say, God, I am wandering around in grief and I am oppressed by my enemies. And at last He brings us challenges, those elements, those people, those substances or those situations that is oppressing him, that is trying to tie him down. He brings those enemies into the presence of God and he tells God, I need a solution about my enemies. Why is this going on? When you are my rock, when you are the one who's supposed to remember me, why does it look like you have forgotten me? When you are the one who's supposed to help me with my grief, why am I still wandering around? And why is it that I am constantly oppressed by my enemies? I need you to go through Psalm 42 and just express your heart to God this morning. If you can relate to any of these grief moments or grief expressions, just express it out to God and let the Lord know that you are still going to seek for the solution for your pain in His presence. Not out there in the world, not on a table of a therapist, not with your friend circle or on a television screen or your phone screen. No, you are still going to find help for your feeling of being abandoned, for your feeling of grief, and for your feeling of oppression right there in the presence of God. That's what the psalmist did, and that's what you and I have to choose to do this morning. And I pray that the presence of God will invade your life like never before, and that God would give you a victory in being able to experience Him that will cause you to forget all of these feelings, cause you to wash away all of your grief and lack or sense of direction. May the Lord be with you through the course of this day ahead.
We hope you are encouraged by today's podcast. To know more about Pastor Preji or other resources you can avail, or to receive help in any specific area, connect with us at pastorpreji.com. We wish you a Christ-filled day ahead.